I think Maria's going to hit record. There we go. And please ask questions in the chat and we'll have time at the end. Okay, next slide. There is a questionnaire in the chat box we'd like you to fill out. We are collecting information data to be able to share what you learned from this presentation. So there's a pre-test and a post-test. And then also we have a ACDD, Alabama Council for Developmental Disabilities questionnaire that we will share at the end. And we want to see what you're learning. We're, like I said, trying to conduct some research about how we are doing program evaluation and making this better in the state of Alabama. And yeah, so go ahead and click on that link and it's available in English and Spanish. And I'm not sure if I shared both, but I can do it again. All right, next slide. And Dr. Christine Drew teaches on Tuesdays, so she's not here. She's one of the three of us. We're the three musketeers on this grant. And then I already introduced myself, and now I'll hand it over to Maria.
Hello, my name is Maria Gutierrez. I am the family navigator for the region number 4, and we cover 20 counties. And we are so excited that you guys are here. And I'm so happy to see so many professionals and so many families. So thank you for taking time of your busy morning. We hope that you guys enjoy the holidays and, you know, and now are ready to learn about this very important topic that is about Medicaid waivers. So I know that for the professionals, sometimes you encounter families that are going to have a hard time understanding the whole process. So we hope that this will help you clarify some of the questions and in assisting those families getting those services. And now I'm going to pass it to Ms. Shandra from ADAP. And if Ms. Shandra, if you would like to introduce yourself, and now the floor is all yours. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maria. So my name is Shandra Monterastelli. I am a staff attorney at the Alabama Disabilities Advocacy Program. I handle a lot of our Medicaid waiver related advocacy, and I am here to talk to y'all about Medicaid waivers today, kind of everything from top to bottom. So we're going to cover what a waiver is, what services are available, how they work, how to apply for one, and what to do in the case of an adverse decision. So I will go ahead and jump right into it. So for those of you who do know me, I used to be a teacher before I was a lawyer, so I love to have learning goals whenever I do a presentation. So our learning goal for today is to answer these questions. So we're going to answer the questions: what are home and community-based services? What is a Medicaid waiver and what is being waived? What kinds of waiver programs are there? What services can I get under a Medicaid waiver? Who is eligible for a Medicaid waiver? How do I apply for a Medicaid waiver? How do waiting lists for Medicaid waivers work? How is the new community waiver program going to eliminate the waiting list? What happens once I'm on a waiver? What is person-centered planning and how does it work? And what do I do if Medicaid makes a decision I don't agree with? So we have a lot to cover today. It can be a little complex. It can be a little complicated. We're going to make time, of course, to answer any and all of your questions at the end of this presentation. And of course, I will make sure all these materials get circulated so that everybody has them kind of at their fingertips for review. So first big question: what are home and community-based services? So if you're familiar with Medicaid waivers at all, you've probably heard the term HCBS. HCBS stands for Home and Community-Based Services, and HCBS programs, or Medicaid waivers, are a really important tool for community integration when they're used appropriately and to their full extent by state agencies. Home and community-based services exist as alternatives to institutionalization, and they're designed to ensure that individuals who may otherwise need to reside in a setting like a nursing facility or another institutional setting, can instead reside in their own home or their own community and still receive the services and care that they need. So waiver programs, Medicaid waiver programs, allow states to disregard certain Medicaid rules and requirements in order to provide more services to more people. So the reason they're called waivers is because Medicaid states are able to waive those requirements, or like I said, to disregard them in order to provide services to people who otherwise would only be eligible to receive those services in an institutional setting, like a nursing facility, or who may not be able to receive those services at all. State and federal Medicaid programs are increasingly focused on providing home and community-based services as an alternative to institutional care. In 2013, the majority of Medicaid spending on long-term services and supports, or LTSS, was for home and community-based services for the first time ever. And that was up from 18% in 1995 to 51% in 2013. So you can see the focus on providing services in the community is really increasing. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide here in just a second. So what is a Medicaid waiver and what is being waived? So we've already gone through this a little bit, but typically there are 3 requirements that are waived or disregarded when a state creates a Medicaid waiver program. And these are the requirements of statewide-ness, comparability of services, and income and resource rules that are applicable in the community. So of course, you know, this all sounds super complex. So what do these terms mean? Statewide-ness generally refers to the requirement that Medicaid services have to be administered equally on a statewide basis to everybody who lives in a state and is otherwise eligible for services. So typically under, you know, a standard Medicaid program, every Medicaid eligible person in Alabama has to have access to the same services. Waiving or disregarding the statewide-ness requirement allows states to provide services in specific areas of a state, for example, where there have been higher needs identified or certain availability of providers. We don't currently have anything like that in Alabama, but just as an example of how that would work practically, in the state of California at one time, there was a waiver that was only available for people who lived in San Francisco. So again, nothing like that in Alabama right now, but that is how one would work practically. The next major requirement that gets waived is the requirement of comparability of services. So typically, Medicaid services have to be equally available to and comparable between all recipients in a state. So again, this kind of gets back to everybody in a state on standard Medicaid is entitled to the same services. HCBS programs allow states to make certain services available under a waiver program only to certain groups of people who are at risk of having to go into an institution. So for example, somebody with an intellectual disability who otherwise would have to receive care in a nursing facility or institution-like setting, instead he can get onto the ID waiver and receive those services in the community. Some states have waivers specific to certain illnesses or certain diagnoses and conditions. For example, a lot of states, including Alabama, have programs specific to people living with HIV or AIDS. So that's kind of what the waiving comparability of services looks like. And then finally, the last requirement that gets waived most often are requirements related to income and resource rules that apply in the community. So the financial stuff can get really complicated and individualized. So I'm not going to get super deep into this right now. I just will say that waiver programs have the ability to allow states to provide Medicaid to people who, for financial reasons, would otherwise only be eligible in an institutional setting. So some of those really stringent financial requirements can be waived under or disregarded under waiver programs. So I'm going to move on to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so next big question is, what kinds of waiver programs are there? So there are actually 5 different types of waiver programs. The primary one, I think the one that we all kind of think of when we think of a Medicaid waiver, is a 1915C program. So this is the first and primary federal waiver program, and home and community-based services first became available through 1915C waivers in 1983, when Congress added Section 1915C to the Social Security Act. And this gave states the option to receive a waiver of Medicaid rules governing institutional care. So essentially, states were allowed to disregard certain rules, again, to be able to provide more services to more people. So typically under 1915C programs, states will disregard the 3 requirements we just talked about: the statewide-ness, the comparability of services, and the income and resource rules requirements. And this will allow states to serve more people under these programs. 1915I programs are similar to 1915C programs, but they're not traditional waiver programs. Instead, 1915I programs allow states to amend their standard Medicaid state plan rather than seeking a federal waiver program. So rather than making a whole new program, states can add certain services to the Medicaid program that they already have in place. So recipients still have to meet state-defined criteria based on need, and they typically get a combination of acute care medical services like dental services and skilled nursing services, and then long-term services like respite, case management, and supported employment services. Again, these are just examples in home and community-based settings. So again, functionally, 1915I programs are pretty similar to 1915C programs, but there are a couple of important differences. Primarily, 1915I programs don't require that the recipient need the same level of care as a 1915C program does. Under a 1915I program, states also cannot cap enrollment, and services have to be offered to everybody statewide. Now, states can tighten up eligibility criteria if they need to limit the number of people on the program, but they cannot cap it at a maximum number of people enrolled. All right, going to go on to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so 1915J and 1915K programs, I'm not going to get super in the weeds on these. 1915J is just the portion of the law that allows individuals to self-direct personal care services. And then 1915K programs, we don't have any of those here in Alabama. So again, I won't get super in depth on that. I'm going to go to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so the last waiver program we're going to talk about is what's called an 1115 demonstration program. So these allow states to create experimental, pilot, or demonstration projects that help states try new ways of serving people. They are flexible and kind of allow states to try new things, to find the best way of getting home and community-based services out to the maximum number of people. The Community Waiver Program, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, is actually one of these, and we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. So I'm going to go on to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so how many waivers are there in Alabama? So this slide's actually a little out of date because the Community Waiver Program did just come online on November 1st. So we actually have 7 waivers in Alabama now. So under the umbrella of the Department of Mental Health, there is the ID waiver and the living at home waiver, and then of course the Community Waiver Program. Under the umbrella of the Department of Rehabilitation Services, or VOC Rehab, there is the SAIL waiver, and that's primarily for people with certain genetic disorders or people with a history of traumatic brain injury. And then under the umbrella of the Department of Senior Services, there's the E&D waiver, or the Elderly and Disabled waiver, the Technology Assisted waiver, which primarily serves people who utilize ventilators. And then there's the Alabama Community Transition Waiver, or the ACT waiver, which primarily serves people who are currently residing in nursing facilities, but looking to get back out into the community, or people who are utilizing the E&D waiver, but who need a little bit more support than that waiver is able to offer. So our waiver programs here in Alabama are a tiny snapshot of kind of the broader availability of waiver services throughout the country. States are permitted to operate as many waiver programs as they want. And throughout the country, there are currently over 300 waiver programs in operation. Some bigger states like Illinois currently have more than 10 active waivers. And then some other states have waivers that are very specific and narrowly defined. So there's a really big variety of waiver programs, not just in Alabama, but throughout the country as a whole, which illustrates just how many options there are to serve people in home and community-based settings. So I'm going to go on to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so what services are available under Medicaid waivers? So one thing I really like to remind people of whenever I can is that Medicaid waivers are not just about medical care. You can get whatever a state seeks to provide under the waiver. So the federal guidelines regarding HCBS waiver services are very broad, and states have equally broad discretion to create waiver programs inside of those guidelines. So you'll see down here in the corner of the slide, I have my little menu, which I use to illustrate the broad menu of services that are available under a lot of waiver programs. They generally combine medical and non-medical services. And the ID waiver and now the Community Waiver Program is a really excellent example of, again, the broad menu of services that can be provided under Medicaid waivers. So the ID waiver, for example, provides for clearly medically based services like skilled nursing and physical therapy, but then also provides for services that are not medical in nature and instead focus more on community integration and improving the beneficiary's quality of life, such as supported employment and community experience services. So I'm going to go on to the next slide in just a second, and we'll talk about kind of broadly what's available in Alabama. Moving on. So under the waivers we have in Alabama, you can get services that will help you find and keep a job, services that will help you stay in your home or find a place to live, move on in just a second. You can get services that'll help you complete household tasks like cooking, cleaning, and grocery shopping. You can get services that will help you obtain assistive technology. You can get services that will help you participate in your community. Move on in just a second. You can get services that will help you make your home accessible and help you understand and manage your federal benefits like SSI and SSDI. And many, many more. Again, each waiver has a very broad variety of services that are designed to support and enable recipients to live their best lives in the community. And we can make sure actually that there's a little chart that the Medicaid agency puts out that describes each service that's available under each waiver. So we'll go ahead and make sure that gets circulated. So again, everybody has that as kind of a reference. You also have the right to self-direct most of the services available under each waiver. The only exception to that is the TA waiver, which doesn't allow for self-direction, but all of the rest of the waivers allow recipients to self-direct at least some, if not most, of the services. So self-directed services are services that are planned and purchased under the direction and control of the waiver recipient. And the waiver recipient dictates the amount, duration, scope, provider, and location of the services. So basically what this boils down to is that if you choose to self-direct your services, you're going to get a monthly financial allowance, which you'll use to manage your services, rather than having the case management agency be completely responsible for managing your services. So it gives you a lot more freedom in deciding, what you're going to do, workers you're going to hire, things like that. When you're utilizing self-directed services, you can choose to use your money to do things like hire aides, to buy durable medical equipment or assistive technology, or you can actually bank that money and put it toward other services. So, a lot of times I'll have people save up for big purchases like communication devices or lift chairs. Those are just a few of the things you can do with the self-directed option. And if you do choose to self-direct your services, then the state has to provide you with the appropriate support to ensure that you're able to do so successfully. So you should never be out there just kind of like all on your own. You should be adequately supported in self-directing your services. So I'm going to move on to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so who is eligible for Medicaid waivers? So this varies based on the waiver you're applying for. But what all waivers have in common is that you have to meet both financial eligibility criteria and medical criteria. And then some of the waivers have what's called program criteria, which we'll discuss a little bit more in a second. So in order to qualify for Medicaid, you have to be, of course, an Alabama resident and a U.S. national, citizen, permanent resident, or legal alien who is in need of healthcare insurance assistance and whose financial situation would be characterized as low income or very low income. This is what, of course, the Medicaid website says. So these are the very basic requirements to be eligible for Medicaid. The financial eligibility criteria takes into account your assets and resources as well as your income. And the medical, the medical criteria takes into account your need for long-term care and what services and supports the waiver can offer. So I'll go on to the next slide in just a second. So as far as the finances go, as we discussed earlier, you can be financially eligible for a waiver without necessarily being eligible for standard Medicaid. Like we talked about, states have the option to disregard some of the financial rules that apply to standard Medicaid. And so they can be a little more lenient when it comes to determining who is financially eligible. So I have an example on the next slide, which I'll go on to in just a second. So a good example of somebody who can be eligible for a Medicaid waiver would be a young man in his early 20s who lives with his family, and his family has sufficient financial assets that this young man probably would not ordinarily be eligible for Medicaid. However, this young man receives SSI, so he is presumptively eligible for Medicaid, because if you receive SSI, then you're automatically financially eligible for waiver services. So again, like we talked about earlier, the financial stuff can get really complex and it's really individualized. So I don't get super in depth on these presentations, but I'm always available and always happy to have individual discussions and answer individual questions about the financial aspects of this Medicaid waiver stuff. So I will go on to the next slide in just a second. So once you are determined financially eligible for the waiver, you have to be determined eligible for the specific long-term services and supports that that waiver provides. So for some of the waivers, like the E&D waiver, for instance, the only requirement is that you need long-term care, basically, that you would otherwise need care in a nursing facility. Other waivers have specific program criteria. So for instance, the ID waiver, the community waiver, and the living at home waiver all require that applicants have an intellectual disability. The SAIL waiver requires that an applicant have either a rare genetic disease or a history of traumatic brain injury to be eligible. So the eligibility for those waivers is kind of in three parts. You have to be financially eligible, you have to need long-term care, and then you have to meet the specific program requirements of the waiver. For the E&D waiver, for instance, there's only two parts. It's the financial part and then needing long-term care. Of course, what all of the waivers have in common is that the applicant has to be at risk of nursing institutionalization in order to be eligible. So the next questions are, how do I apply for a waiver? And then of course, these kind of go hand in hand. How do waiting lists work for the waivers? So I'll go on to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so the process of applying for a waiver varies a little bit depending on which waiver you're looking to apply for. So for the ID and living at home waivers, but you can initiate the application by calling the Department of Mental Health's toll-free number. And again, this will all get circulated so that everybody has access to this contact information and the phone numbers that I'm going to project over the next couple of slides. Once you call that toll-free number, there will be an intake interview, and then you will be transferred to your local case management agency to handle the rest of the application process. So for the ID and living at home waivers, that's going to include a criticality assessment to determine where your priority is for admission onto the waiver, a psychological assessment, and then any other evaluations that are necessary to establish the applicant's need for the waiver's level of care. So I'll go to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so of course, you can't talk about applying for waivers without talking about waiting lists. I get a lot of questions about these. These issues come up quite a bit. One really important thing to remember is that you have the right to a prompt determination of your eligibility for services. So under federal regulations, once you submit an application for a waiver, Medicaid has 90 days to decide whether you are eligible or ineligible for that waiver. Now, if you are eligible, but there's no open slots, there's no space on the waiver, then you're going to be put on the statewide waiting list. So for the ID and living at home waivers, if you're determined eligible and placed on a waiting list, your position on that waiting list is going to be determined by your criticality score, which of course has to do with things like your living situation, whether you have available caregivers, whether you're at risk of harm or abuse or neglect without the waiver. All of these things are taken into consideration in determining what the applicant's criticality is. So individuals who receive a criticality score of 1 are determined to have the highest criticality, and they will be prioritized for entry onto either the ID or the living at home waivers. Now the community waiver program is going to work a little differently, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. One thing I tell people all the time is it's really important to make sure you're keeping things moving while you're on the waiting list. So make sure to keep in contact with your case manager, your support coordinator while you're on the waiting list, because certain life changes can increase your criticality and get you onto a waiver faster. And of course, this applies to other waivers as well, like the E&D waiver, for instance. Certain life changes can increase your priority for entry onto a waiver. So make sure that your case manager or the person at your local case management agency knows when your circumstances change. That is really, really important. So I'll go on to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so for the community waiver program, again, this is a little bit out of date because it did finally come online on November 1st. Right now, it's only available in 11 pilot counties, which we'll talk about in a second. And enrollment is handled by the Department of Mental Health Central Office and not local case management agencies. So prospective applicants should still contact that main hotline to work through the application process. So enrollment otherwise is going to work pretty similarly, but it's really important to note that criticality is not going to be an admission consideration for the community waiver program. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute as well. So I'll go on to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so for the first 5 years of its operation, the community waiver program is only going to be available in Baldwin, Elmore, Houston, Jefferson, Limestone, Madison, Mobile, Montgomery, Morgan, Tuscaloosa, and Walker counties. So all of those counties, instead of the ID waiver, are going to be admitting people to the community waiver program. In every other county, it's still going to be the ID waiver, so kind of business as usual during the pilot period in those other counties. And I'll move on to the next slide in just a second. So like we talked about just a second ago, the community waiver program is no longer going to use criticality as an admissions consideration. Instead, for the community waiver program, individuals are going to be prioritized for entry based on either whether they are currently living independently or with family and seek to maintain that arrangement, or they currently have or are seeking competitive integrated employment and seek to maintain that arrangement. So individuals in those two groups are going to be who's prioritized for entry onto the community waiver program rather than prioritizing people by criticality, like the ID waiver and the living at home waiver have done. So I'll move on to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so applying for waivers run by ADSS, that's the E&D waiver, the ACT waiver, and the TA waiver. Very similar. You can contact your local area agency on aging, and you can find this information either by going to alabamaageline.gov or by calling either of the phone numbers currently on this slide. And again, we'll make sure this gets circulated so everybody has this contact information. There will be an intake interview, and then you'll be put on the referral list. And once you're on the front of the referral list, your eligibility for the waiver will be determined and planning your services will begin. So I will go on to the next slide in just a second. Okay. And then applying for the sale waiver, again, that's through Voc Rehab. You can contact your local Voc Rehab district office or the statewide sale hotline. Again, we'll make sure this contact information gets circulated. There will be an intake interview. And then as far as we are aware right now, the sale waiver does not currently have a waiting list. So once applicants are determined eligible for the waiver, they'll be admitted and begin receiving services. So I will go on to the next slide in just a second. Okay. So a question I've been getting a lot is how is the community waiver program going to eliminate the statewide waiting list? And one of the things we're really excited about with this new program is that it really seeks to target people before they end up in a situation where their needs are really, really great, or where they're in, an emergency and they need waiver services immediately. So by catching people early and providing them with the supports they need to maintain, their current situation, their current standard of living, and not waiting to catch people, until they're in an emergency situation and they need a lot of services to be able to stay safe, more and more people are going to have access to those services. So we're really excited to see how that plays out. Again, it's in the very early stages right now, but from an advocacy perspective, we're really excited about it. I will go on to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so what happens after you get admitted to a waiver? So one really, really important thing that I always want to make sure to really drive home when I do these presentations or when I'm talking to individuals is to remember that once you're on a waiver, you have a legal entitlement to all of the services available under that waiver. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you can get all of them at the same time, because some of them, may kind of do the same thing. But overall, you do have an entitlement to all of the services available under whatever waiver you are on. But to that end, it's really, really important to remember that any and all waiver services that you want must be in your person-centered plan, or Medicaid won't pay for them. So this includes services that you'll begin receiving at the time you're admitted onto the waiver, and any additional or different services that you may end up needing at any point while you're a waiver recipient. This might include new medical services like skilled nursing or assistive technology, depending on how your needs might change, or it might include new supports like supported employment or housing stabilization. It's really important to remember that you have the right to add, remove, change, increase, or decrease your services at any time based on your needs. Your waiver should grow and change with you and support you at, wherever you're at in your life. So because Medicaid won't cover services that are not in your person-centered plan, the most important advocate you have at your planning meetings is yourself. Your care team is there to ensure that you have the appropriate services to live the life that you want to live, and your person-centered plan should include those services. So the best thing, I always tell people, the best thing you can do for yourself at your person-centered planning meeting is prepare yourself with the knowledge of which services are available under the waiver and which of those services you want. One thing I think it's really important to remember is that waivers are not just about finding recipients a place to go during the day and a place to sleep at night. They're about ensuring that every waiver recipient can live the life that he wants to live and that he's appropriately supported in doing so. So for all of these reasons, the person-centered plan is possibly the most important document related to the provision of waiver services for any given individual. Of course, the significance is obtaining waiver services in the first place, since as we discussed, Medicaid will not cover any services that are not in the person-centered plan. But the person-centered plan is equally important because it's an opportunity for the care team to get to know the waiver recipient and to determine not only what are his needs, but what are his wants? What is he like? What is he not like? What are his goals for the future? And no matter the nature or the level of the waiver beneficiary's disability, his person-centered plan must cover not only his basic services that he needs to stay healthy in the community, but the services that are going to allow him to have the best possible quality of life and independence. So I'll go on to the next slide in just a second. Okay, so what is person-centered planning and how does it work? So we've already gotten into that a little bit, but we're going to talk a little bit more about person-centered planning in a little more detail. So your person-centered plan is all about you. So you get to choose who provides your services. You get to choose who lives with you, or you get to choose to live alone if that's what you want. You get to choose what services you receive. You get to choose where you live. You get to choose where you receive services. So things like where you go to your day program, where you work if you want to have a job, things like that. And it's your right to make those decisions for yourself. Now, of course, you should be appropriately supported and accommodated in doing so, but you have the right to make the decisions about your life, and your person-centered plan should reflect that. At your person-centered planning meeting, you also have a variety of rights designed to protect your independence and decision-making ability. So you've got the right to choose who's at your meeting. You've got the right to lead the meeting if you want to, and to be appropriately supported in doing so. You have the right to make informed choices and be provided with the appropriate amount of information to be able to make those choices. I'll go on in just a second. You have the right to meet at a time and place that is convenient for you. You have the right to information that is easy to understand. And you have the right to be free from conflicts in the planning process, and your care team should be making sure that those conflicts are avoided. I'll go on in just a second. Okay. And at your person-centered planning meeting, I always say you're the star of your own show. So your person-centered plan is all about you. Your wants, needs, goals, hopes, dreams, and desires are the most important things, and your choices are yours to make. All right, go on in just a second. Okay, so wrapping up, what do I do if Medicaid makes a decision I don't agree with? So if you're in a situation where Medicaid has reduced or taken away or denied your eligibility for services, what do you do? So you have the right to file for a documentary review with whatever agency operates your waiver. You have the right to a fair hearing in front of an administrative law judge at the Alabama Medicaid agency. And you have rights at that fair hearing, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But one really important thing to remember is that if you're in a situation where you receive a notice that something is being taken away, or something is being reduced, or you're not eligible for something, you need to act quickly because the time to appeal is very limited. If you want a documentary review, it's usually 15 days. And if you want to go straight to a fair hearing, it's usually 60 days. So you got to make sure you're staying on top of those time frames. It's really important. I'll go on in just a second. Okay. Also, really important to remember with regard to timeframes is that if you're already receiving Medicaid services at the time you receive the notice of adverse action, so something's being reduced, something's being taken away, something is being suspended, you have the right to continue receiving those services as long as you timely file for the appeal. So typically, if you file within 10 days to let them know you're appealing, you can keep receiving services throughout the entire appeals process up until the Medicaid commissioner's final decision. I'll go on in just a second. Okay, and at your fair hearing, you have a variety of due process rights that are intended to protect you as the Medicaid beneficiary. So you have the right to review your entire case file before the date of the fair hearing. You have the right to submit your own evidence at the fair hearing. You have the right to call your own witnesses and ask them questions, and you have the right to question Medicaid's witnesses. You have the right to make an opening and closing statement. You have the right to represent yourself or to obtain legal counsel at your own expense. And you have the right to make your case without undue interference by Medicaid. Hold on just a second. Okay, so we're about at the end now. One thing we do encourage is if you're ever in this situation again, where you've gotten this notice that something is being suspended or reduced or taken away, we highly encourage you to reach out to us as soon as you get that notice. I have our contact information projected here. And again, we will make sure this gets circulated. And that is it for me. So, Dr. Hill, I'll turn it back over to you just to go over this post-assessment, and then we'll get to the questions.
I'll put this survey from the ACDD in the chat, or Maria will in just a second. If you would please, while we're asking questions and fielding those, please fill out the ACDD survey that tells them how we're doing. And before Yeah, well, I'll put that in just a second. And I did put in the Alabama ageline.gov and the 800 number that Shandra shared with us. So if you want to write that down, I think the biggest thing I've learned so far is that when in doubt, call, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and I'm gonna hand it over to Maria right now.
Okay, Ms. Shandra, this is great, valuable information. And I know that it's a lot to digest in an hour, but I'll be sending the copy of the PowerPoint in English and Spanish. And, and also we'll share your information so that if people have questions, they could reach out to you. And I will be posting the links for the ACDD survey. We really would like you to fill out these surveys as they provide us with feedback for us and also for ACDD, for them to see the importance of continue supporting these programs to share that information with families and professionals, and especially with this outreach for the Spanish-speaking community that is impacted by intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities. So with that being said, Ms. Shandra, I've been typing the questions
I see.
and send them to you. There are a lot of questions, so, and they're still coming. So if you want to start and go ahead and go all the way back, probably some of those have been already explained, but I guess just for sakes of people that join in later, or some people were having problems popping in and out.
Great. Okay, so I will go ahead and get to these questions. Please, of course, feel free to, as I'm fielding these, if anything else comes up, go ahead and ask more. But we have quite a few to work through here, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So the first question: at what age should I apply for this waiver? My child is 9 years old with an intellectual disability and autism. So I'm going to assume you're talking about either the ID waiver or the community waiver. And my answer is you should apply immediately. Kids can be eligible for either of those waivers at the age of 3. So if you've got a child who's 9 and they have an intellectual disability, depending on what your county you're in, you're either going to do the community waiver or the ID waiver. But I strongly encourage you to apply like now. We help with those a lot. So again, my contact information is going to get circulated. If the person who asked this question wants to reach out to me directly, I'm more than happy to talk you through that process. Next question: do parents' income count against qualifying for the waivers, and how about when the person becomes an adult? So this is like a funny thing that we run into quite a bit, because no, the parent's income is not supposed to count against qualifying for the waivers. It's a very complex process about how income is deemed and how it's, assigned to certain members of the family, but the short answer is no, it should not be regarded as the child's income when you're applying for the waiver on the child's behalf. When the person becomes an adult, it's the same thing. It should not be counted against the applicant. Next question: can you qualify for more than one waiver? Yes, you can, but you can only be on one waiver at a time. So you might be eligible technically for like 3 or 4 waivers, but you can't be receiving services from 3 or 4 waivers. So for instance, if you're eligible for like the ID waiver and the END waiver and the living at home waiver, you have to pick which one of those you want to be on. You can't be on all of them. I will say, however, though, you can be on a waiting list for one waiver while receiving services from another waiver. So for instance, you can get on the waiting list for the ID waiver and then receive services from the END waiver while you're waiting to get onto the ID waiver. The only thing is once you become, once your number gets called for the ID waiver, you have to make a decision whether you want to switch to that or stay on the E&D waiver. So yes, short answer, you can qualify for, potentially all the waivers, but you can only receive services from one at a time. Somebody asked, is the TA waiver limited only to medical supplies or also for home modifications? I can't remember that off of the top of my head, but I will make sure that the list, and this actually answers another question, I will make sure that the list of services from the Medicaid agency gets circulated as well. So everybody will kind of have that as a reference point. Let's see, somebody asks, are the waivers funded by the federal government or only by the state? Really great question. So they're funded by the state and federal government. There's what's called state match. So the federal government, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services funds a certain amount, and then the state of Alabama makes up the rest. Next question, when you're talking about services for each waiver, is there a list of what those services are? Yes, there is, and we will make sure that gets circulated, like I said, to make sure everybody has that at their fingertips. Somebody asked, do I have to save receipts to show how funds are being spent? So that's more of a question about being a person's like representative payee. If you're talking about self-directed and utilizing the self-directed savings account, typically you have to get approval for whatever you're going to spend before you actually buy it. But when in doubt, saving your receipts is always a good idea, just kind of as a general rule, I think. Okay, somebody asked, oh, this is a great question. If the person is a US citizen, but the legal caregivers are not, can the person still qualify? Yes, absolutely. As long as the applicant is a US citizen, a legal alien, as they say, or I can't remember off the top of my head what the other categories are, but yes, if the applicant is a US citizen, they can still qualify. Again, really great question. Somebody asked, what is standard Medicaid? So standard Medicaid is just like the regular Medicaid state plan that doesn't include waiver services. So basically it's like, standard healthcare for low-income individuals who have disabilities, children, or are pregnant or caregivers. That's what standard Medicaid is. Okay, next question. Does a person with a diagnosis of autism but who doesn't have an intellectual disability, can they still qualify for a waiver? Okay, this is a tough one. So if you want to apply for the ID waiver or the living at home waiver or the community waiver on that person's behalf, they have to have a diagnosis of intellectual disability. Just autism alone is not sufficient to be eligible for any of those waivers. Now that person could conceivably be eligible for like the E&D waiver maybe, but just with a diagnosis of autism, they're not going to be eligible for ID, living at home, or community waiver. The person who asked this, I would love to talk to you more on an individual basis. So again, when my contact information gets circulated, please just send me an email or give me a call so we can talk in a little more detail. Okay, next question. Can they deny you over the phone? No, they may not. That is a big no-no. If you're going to be denied services or if your services are going to be terminated or reduced, you have to be provided notice in writing. That is a matter of federal law. You cannot be verbally denied. You cannot be denied over the phone. So if that happened to you, I don't know when it happened, but if it was recent, I would immediately call back and try to get something in writing because, again, under federal law, they have to provide you with written notice of any decision that negatively affects you. Okay. Somebody asked, can you give an example of what level of criticality means and how bad you need to be or how drastic the needs of the person must be before they can move up on the waiting list? Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So criticality for the ID waiver and the living at home waiver goes from levels 1 to 5. And so level 1 is the highest level of criticality. So for people who are at level 1, it's going to be people who, if they don't get a waiver, they're going to be homeless, they're going to be at risk of abuse or neglect, somebody who like their only caregiver has passed away or become incapacitated. Things like that are going to put you in that very, very first level of criticality. And then for the lower levels, it's people who need or want waiver services, but they're not at immediate risk of harm or danger without them. So for the people in the lower levels, it's people who, you know, maybe just need like some extra supports, or maybe want to explore some new waiver services, but, you know, they're not at risk of harm. They're not in danger. Like they're doing okay with where they are right now. I hope those examples kind of help. Okay. Next question, who is the administrator of the waivers? Is this like a social worker assigned to the person, like my point of contact? So if you or your child, your loved one are on a waiver, they should have a case manager or a support coordinator, and that person should be your point of contact and kind of your gateway to all of the waiver services and all of your waiver questions. Of course, the administrators of the waivers are the state agencies who operate them, but your support coordinator or your case manager is the person who kind of is the go-between for you and for those agencies to make sure you're getting what you need. Now, if you don't know who your case manager is, then that says to me that person maybe has not been in contact with you as much as they should have been. So I would reach out to the case management agency for whatever waiver you're on and whatever county you're in, and maybe try and get that person's contact information. That would be what I would do in that situation. Okay, somebody asked if my child is still very young, who is the person I should talk to in order to get assistance on applying for the ID waiver? So that's a really good question. Now, if your child is under 3 years old, they can't be eligible yet. The ID waiver is for people 3 and above. If you are interested, if your child is, you know, over that age and you are interested in applying for the waiver, I would recommend reaching out to the case management agency for your county. That'll be the 310 board. Of course, I don't know, just based on this question, I don't know what county you're in. But if you want to let Maria know, she can send it to me and then I can let you know who your point of contact would be for that. Okay, wow, this is a doozy of a question. Somebody asks, my child qualified for the E&D waiver, but the social worker told me my son only qualified for meal delivery because I do not have a valid social security number because of my legal status. They asked for a sponsor in order to have access to the other benefits. What are my other options? Wow. So I have never encountered this situation before, but I would love to talk to you about this more. So maybe we can find some answers. So when my contact information gets passed around, please send me an email or give me a call. Because like I said, I've never encountered this, so I can't just answer you off the top of my head, but I would love to look at this a little bit more and maybe help find some kind of solution. Okay. Somebody asks, can they provide an interpreter so I can communicate, or do I have to bring my own? So if you're talking about like the person-centered planning meeting, they're not under any obligation to provide you with an interpreter. Unfortunately, there's no legal obligation for them to do so. So you're in a position of probably needing to bring your own. And then somebody asks, who can I ask to help me with the appealing process, and are the documents sent in another language? So I'll answer your second question first. Unfortunately, as far as I know, the documents only get sent out in English, which is kind of a whole problem in and of itself. As far as who you can ask to help you with the appealing process, ADAP handles a lot of these. So again, I would strongly encourage you to contact us if you're in that situation, and we can take a look at that and see what we might be able to do. Okay, so that's the first round of questions. Somebody says, okay, my child has a diagnosis of ASD and ID. What waiver program should we apply for? So if your child has a diagnosis of intellectual disability, I strongly encourage you to apply for the ID waiver or for the community waiver if you're in one of those pilot counties. Absolutely 100%. That would be what I would encourage. Okay, somebody asks, for person-centered planning, when parents are making decisions for an adult child with intellectual disabilities, how important is it for the parent to seek a guardianship? So here at ADAP, from an agency standpoint, we do not encourage guardianships. We encourage less restrictive options like powers of attorney. So insofar as how important it is to seek that, obviously it really depends on your adult child's needs, their ability to communicate and advocate for themselves, which you know, of course, better than I do. But I would strongly encourage a less restrictive option like a power of attorney, rather than a guardianship in that situation. Somebody asked, is the ID waiver interchangeable with an HCBS waiver? So yes, HCBS waiver is kind of the umbrella term for all Medicaid waivers. So the ID waiver is an HCBS waiver. Really good question. Let's see. So somebody asked, how is it expected that a person with a severe intellectual disability that is nonverbal help make decisions about what they want? Of course, that's up to that individual's care team, family, everybody who's kind of in their corner to help support them, without knowing kind of the individual person's situation. I can't really speak to, how it should be expected for them to make decisions for themselves, because I don't know, how they communicate. I don't know what their level of comprehension is, but they should be, appropriately supported by their care teams, by their families, by anybody else, like I said, who's kind of in their corner, to make sure that, to the extent they're able to do so, they're able to make their needs known and, be getting the services and supports that they want in order to live the life that they want. Someone asked, if the parents are medically fragile and disabled themselves, does that count as an increased level of criticality? Yes, it absolutely can increase the waiver recipient's level of criticality. So that's definitely something to make sure that your case manager knows about when you're applying or when you're on the waiting list, because yes, it absolutely can increase the criticality score. Okay. Somebody asked, how do I know if my child's CRS coordinator filled out the waiver for us and if my child is on any of the waivers waiting list? So to find out whether they filled out a waiver application for you, of course, you'd want to ask that person, I think. And then to find out if your child is on the waivers waiting list, if you contact any of those toll-free numbers, because I'm not sure what waivers specifically you're talking about. So if you contact the toll-free numbers for those agencies, again, if it's the ID, living at home, or community waiver, you're going to contact the Department of Mental Health. If it is the TA waiver, the E&D waiver, or the ACT waiver, you're going to contact the Department of Senior Services. And if it is the SAIL waiver, you're going to contact Voc Rehab. So whatever waiver you think had been applied for, you're going to contact those agencies and get connected with a waiting list coordinator who can let you know if your child is on the waiting list and then where they are on that waiting list. And again, we're going to make sure all that contact information gets circulated so you have those numbers. Okay, someone asked, does an ASD diagnosis alone for a person who doesn't have an intellectual condition, can he still apply for any of the waivers? He doesn't want to live with his parents anymore, but he can't live alone. What are his options? So if he doesn't have an intellectual disability, he can't qualify for the ID waiver, the living at home waiver, or the community waiver. But the other waivers, so I think like the E&D waiver, for instance, would be a good option for this individual. The only issue there is so the person who asked this question says he can't live alone. Of course, I don't know if he needs constant supervision, if he can be alone at all. If he does need constant supervision, then it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get that under the E&D or the ACT waiver. But depending on what his situation is, you can definitely at least start by getting some hours of like personal care, for example, under those waivers, and then kind of working up so the person is supervised, as appropriate. Okay. My husband has a nephew that is a USA citizen and he has a diagnosis of ASD, but he lives out of the country. Can he still qualify for a waiver? So he's got to be here in Alabama to be on an Alabama waiver. Alabama is only going to provide services to people who are in the state of Alabama. Now, of course, if he was in another state, he could apply for waivers in whatever state he was in. But if he wants to receive services in Alabama, he's got to be here in Alabama. Is that all the questions?
Those are all the questions so far. So
all right.
I will say that they are very important questions and very relevant. So thank you for answering those questions. Would you like to add anything else, Ms. Shandra?
I don't have anything else to add right now other than these were incredible questions. Y'all are keeping me on my toes, which I love. So please, to the individuals I flagged, please absolutely reach out to me so we can discuss your situations a little more in depth. Of course, anybody else with any questions at all, or if you need a little guidance, please feel free to email, call me, text me, and we'll find you some answers. That's all I've got.
Could you put your email in the chat again for them?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
And people appreciate your time and the way you explain it. Okay, so thank you so very much, Ms. Shandra, for your time and for your expertise. And I'll be sending the copy of the PowerPoints in English and Spanish. And once we we are recording this presentation and we are going to be added to the YouTube channel that we have for the H-Strand as part of the grant program that we have. And so that for people could go and review it, later on. But, we're gonna have Ms. Shandra again on Friday. So please make sure that you share the next event, okay, for this coming Friday in the evening. We hope that you share this information with the families that you serve or with other professionals. And I'm sure that we'll have maybe some other questions that are different. But I feel that this was a great presentation. Dr. Hill, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Well, I did want to echo Maria's thoughts about Ms. Monterastelli, and thank you for presenting today. We've certainly appreciated that. And that Friday will be at 5 p.m. I also wanted to thank our interpreters who are awesome and provide language access for our families. And that's so important. And the biggest thing I learned is when in doubt, call. I mean, you just covered so much information. And there's this Friday for a repeat of this presentation, but in December, we will have one at 10 a.m. on the 14th on therapeutic programs in Alabama. And that's all I have, Maria.
And also, if you are a professional, please let your families that you're working with, that we will have Korean interpretation for Friday evening. So we want to make sure that we reach out to our families and as many families across the state of Alabama. So please help us share that information. And I will send another email reminder with the flyers in English and Spanish and Korean as well. So with that being said, Ms. Shandra, thank you again. This was an awesome presentation and lots of information, but it was something that we've been wanting to share with our families and with our professionals as well.
Well,
I
thank
did
you.
want to say, Ms. Shandra, that you, it was perfect the way you waited after each slide. I think that was a real help for our interpreters.
Oh, good. Okay, good. I'm glad.
Yes, and thank you again to our interpreters. I know that this helps a lot of our Spanish-speaking families, and this is a way that we're trying to reach out to the Spanish community in the state of Alabama so that they could have this valuable information to make informed decisions for their loved ones. So thank you again, and we will see you Friday.
All right, thank you so much.